Hello and welcome to Traumainformed Support. I'm your host, Dr. Kay Eyre. What do you do when your students don't trust you? For children who have experienced abuse and neglect, forming trusting attachments to adults and peers can be a challenge. In an effort to not be abused or taken advantage of again, these children develop coping strategies that take the form of attachment disorders, an inability to form meaningful relationships. So how do you teach these children? Today we speak with Nicola Marshall. Nicola is an educator and the founder of the Brave Hearts Education. Trained and certified as a life coach, Nicola has spent 5 years helping others in all walks of life. In May 2008, her life changed when she adopted a sibling group of 3. This led her into the world of attachment and trauma with a bang. Living with the realities of children who have experienced trauma has led her to study theories and strategies to help such children. Nicola has authored several books and has established her consulting agency, Brave Heart Education, in West Midlands in the United Kingdom. Nicola will be interviewed by my colleague, Dr. Gavin Krishnamurthy. I hope you find the interview useful.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the podcast. We have Nicola Marshall here today. Hi Nicola, it's great to have you here.
Hi there, it's really good to be here.
Excellent. So we might just jump right into it. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to the work that you kind of do at the moment.
Okay, well, my background in terms of work has always kind of been in the field of people development, I guess, management. I've always been interested in what makes people tick, different people's behavior, different people's learning styles, those kind of things. But not really around children, more around just general adults. Until 10 years ago, when my husband and I adopted 3 children. So they're a sibling group. They've always been together. They were 4, 5, and 7 when they came to live with us. So that kind of brought me into this world of trauma with a bang, as you can imagine. They've got varying degrees of attachment difficulties. And really, I would say that totally changed my life. It's changed my friendships. It's changed, my social activities. And it's changed my work incredibly. So I then started to learn more about what it actually means. What's different about our children, if anything. What's the impact of their early trauma and their early experiences. And along that journey, it's kind of moved more into training schools, because that was the area that a lot of parents were getting, adoptive parents with their children, was education, just how difficult it is for lots of them to settle in education. There's lots of misunderstanding around their needs. So when we first had our children, I was made redundant from the company I was working with at the time. So, which was fine, to be honest, because I didn't want to go back full time. So I then started my own business, coaching at the time, life coaching. And then it's kind of evolved into training, coaching, writing, speak, lots of different areas, and mainly all around trauma now, really.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. You've had a lived experience of it all, really, firsthand.
Yeah. Yes.
So from that point of view, I mean, you've got both lenses on, really, and I'm sure you've spoken to lots of people through your work. How do you explain what attachment is and how it affects children? What do you think that people kind of don't understand or get wrong when it comes to kids who've had kind of really difficult experiences?
Yeah. I think the difficulty is sometimes some of these theories seem quite complex, but what we try and do in our work is to take these complex theories and make them simple, really. So for me, attachment is about relationship. It's about having your needs met in a good enough fashion. And I know that's hard to kind of quantify what that means, but as a baby, we need to have certain needs met. And when they're not, for whatever reason, and that can be any number of things, it creates this kind of difficulty in relationships as we grow up. So it's we will see children who find it really hard to trust other people, other adults and other children. They have shame at the core of who they are, so they find it really hard to connect with other people because they feel so bad about themselves, and they find it really hard to regulate. So they haven't been co-regulated by their parents, which is what should happen. When they cry, somebody comes and meets that need and regulates them. If they haven't had that, then when they grow up, they find it really hard to regulate. So for me, those three things come together: the trust, trusting that the world's a safe place and that I'm going to be okay. Self-worth, understanding that I have value in the world, and regulate. So I can regulate my emotions. Everybody feels angry, but throwing chairs across the classroom is not a great way to deal with that. So it's those three things for me. And I think often the misunderstandings are because our children look like other children, like their peers. They don't have there's no physical sign of difficulties. It's hard for people to understand that sometimes they seem to be able to control their behavior and other times they can't. And I know that that's about, where they are in their brain at any given time. It's about the fear response, that when they're in that kind of fear part of the brain, they can't think properly, they can't process things. So in our schools, lots of the sanctions and reward systems that we use just make it really hard for them because they can't do that cause and effect thinking process when they're stressed. So I think getting people to understand that they have to feel calm and they have to feel safe in order to be able to learn and do what we're expecting them to do.
Yeah. I'm really curious to hear your experience. We've been talking to people about trauma and attachment for such a long time, and I know for myself, having that first moment of having a child really get quite dysregulated and upset, and you have a first-hand emotional experience of what it's like, and a lot of those things fall into place. I wondered for you, because you wear both those hats, if you ever, if you had a moment like that where a lot of that kind of theory and practice kind of really came to kind of life, and you had a kind of understanding of what it's actually like for this child, or what it's like for you to kind of even witness a child being that upset.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a totally different thing living with a child with trauma than working with them in a school context, for example. And even for us at home, there's many times, I've read lots of books, I know lots of theories, but doing it in practice is a totally different experience because you've got your own feelings, you're triggered by what's going on. But there have been some time, probably during therapy actually, where there's another person in the room and something happens with one of my children and we can both kind of step back and say, did you notice that? Or the things they just said, or the way that they're looking at you for affirmation. And just, it's more stark when you're in an environment that's kind of, like a therapy room and you're just focusing on one child, their difficulties and just how sad their life has been and can be at times, is kind of magnified. Whereas in the home environment, particularly with three, there's always lots of other things going on, and it's hard to focus on, what was that behaviour about just now. We notice, I do lots of stepping back at the end of the day and thinking, reflecting, why, what happened there? Did I respond in the right way? And we say this to schools as well, really, that a lot of it is about being proactive and not reactive, because children who've experienced trauma demand a reaction from us, if you like. And in schools, they really struggle with that, obviously, because they've got lots of other children, young people they've got to manage. So being more proactive, thinking about the environment, and we do the same at home. I know that if it's really planned and structured and there's routine, my children respond much better to that. If it's, a day when I've got up late and it's all over the place and the dog's been sick on the carpet or whatever, it's really hard to manage all of that emotion. It's hard work, and I think this is a thing that people maybe don't understand about adopters or people who are living with this is it's relentless. I think it's very exhausting because we are trying to therapeutically parent, not just parent, but we're also trying to, you know, build trust, build their self-worth, and help them to regulate. And if we're trying to do that all the time, as well as manage our own stuff and our partners and our friends and our parents, you know, it's just really difficult. So yeah, I don't know if that even answers the question.
No, I think it does. And I think it's helpful for people listening, because I think it normalizes some of that, just the sheer emotional kind of drain that comes with having a child in your class, or, you know, whatever context, and how, you know, counterintuitive a lot of this stuff is in terms of, you know, what the child wants from you. And as a teacher, if you haven't necessarily been exposed to a lot of it, you know, it can seem strange. I mean, there's a lot of work around attachment styles and what that looks like in the class. So what were your thoughts about that, and what have you observed about that, Nicola?
Yeah, I found this really, really helpful. And for me personally with my children, but also, you know, when I'm talking to school staff, because there's very different ways that a child might express those attachment needs. And sometimes they do fall into these categories of styles. Sometimes it's, you know, a bit harder to do that. But I've seen it with my own children. So an avoidant attachment style is a style of a child who their main aim in life is to not be noticed. So they tend to be shyer, quieter, more withdrawn. My daughter's like this, very, very compliant, fiercely self-reliant. So she's left school now, she's at college, but she left school with no exam results really, because of the level of anxiety she feels, but she won't tell people. So she was really compliant in school. So she never was on anybody's radar really. And they, for children like that, they become really vulnerable as they get older, because they're open to any you know, anybody else outside of the family shows them some attention, and you know, they're gone really, they're in trouble. And we don't focus very much on them because they are easy to manage because they're quiet.
It's an interesting dilemma.
Yeah.
I was just sorry to interrupt. I was only going to say it's an interesting dilemma with those kids, because I often find that, you know, they're quiet because they don't want to get into trouble or you know, do the wrong thing and just want to fly on the radar because that feels safer. But they get ignored, so that, you know, people are not helping them or tending to them emotionally. And so then there's really difficult double bind, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And then they will end up, it kind of comes out in their behavior. So eventually, with my daughter, if she keeps it in long enough, something will come out. So she might steal, she might lie. She's got friends who self-harm quite a lot, you know, abscond, you know, all of those things that are kind of under the radar, if you like. They're not in your face aggression. They're much more kind of played down really. And I think as well in our school system, it's difficult because a lot of the rules are about appropriate behavior, so keeping it all in, pretending that everything's okay when it's not. So when she has exploded at school, you know, that's seen as a really negative thing, whereas for me as a parent, I see that as a positive thing because she's actually letting it out. But she's not allowed to do that in school, and I understand why, but that's, you know, just I think the lack of understanding that just telling a child to stick on a happy face and pretend everything's okay is not good for a child who is pushing it all down. They'll get health issues in the future, as I say, very vulnerable. You know, so I think there's lots of reasons why we should encourage these children to express. And just saying at the front of the class, look, you know, if you don't understand, come and ask me, is not good enough, because they're not going to do that. Hence why, you know, my daughter's got no real exam results because, you know, the anxiety level is too high, really. And then on the other side of the scale is what we call an ambivalent attachment style, which is a child whose main aim in life is to be noticed. So these, everybody tends to know these. My middle son's a bit like this, so a bit louder, a bit more in your face, tend to know everybody's names and dates and places. in school, they've gone through all the behaviour policy, doesn't make any difference. So they're the same ones in detention, in isolation, because it's all about attention. But this is a real big one for schools to understand, is it's about attention needing, not attention seeking. Because when we talk about attention seeking behaviour, it kind of implies that we should ignore it and they'll stop. But for these children, because it's an unmet need, they won't stop. And then it hikes up to something else. They're then cartwheeling across the carpet. You know, they do everything they possibly can to be seen. And I think that's a real difficult one to understand. And this probably goes against all of our ways of thinking, really, in our societies, is that we shouldn't reward people for bad behaviour, if you like. So if they are cartwheeling across the carpet, and they're not supposed to be, you know, people will say, well, you've got to stop them doing that. But actually, it's a really difficult one to understand, that there's an unmet need underneath there. And all behaviour communicates something, doesn't it? So that is communicating that actually there's anxiety.
Just curious, Nicola, about how you advocated for him, because I can imagine a lot of teachers saying, you know, here's a boy who seems to be living at this point in quite a loving kind of family, and I'm sure he gets a lot of this, you know, this attention that he needs at home. Are we just making excuses? Is he just being naughty? How did you find yourself explaining that to teachers?
It is really hard. I mean, fortunately for him, he wasn't too difficult at school. But I know many, obviously we're talking with schools where they have been really difficult. A friend of mine, her daughter's particularly like this, and we would say to that school, just look at the patterns of behaviour, and try and think about where is this coming from. So if there's a certain teacher, so this was in secondary school, where, you know, here there's lots of different teachers. So if it's a particular teacher that they're, you know, being naughty in, which I don't like that word, but, you know, in their class, then it's looking at, you know, what is it about that teacher that's causing that. I think we've tried to, with schools, we've tried to get them to see that if you give a child like that attention before they're demanding it, then it often alleviates some of that. So there's no point, if they're, you know, sticking their hand up all the time, just ignoring them. You have to acknowledge them and say, yep, I've seen your hand, but I want somebody else to answer the question. And I think with lots of schools, with any of these children, we've just said, just try it, you know, just try a different approach, and see how it works. And actually, you know, building on relationship with a child who needs attention is really, really important. So keep, you know, the first person that you see when you come in the classroom, give them eye contact, say their name, ask them how the weekend was, remember things about them. You know, all of those relationship things, for that child, it's much more important than maybe for an avoidant child. For them, it's more about, you know, you keeping your word and doing things that you say you're going to do, and coming alongside them. I mean, we found that with most schools, just them understanding where those behaviours come from has made a huge difference. To understand that, you know, that bad behaviour, what we call bad behaviour, is actually them communicating a need. You know, the attention needing thing, I think, you know, really helps in that.
Yeah. So, I mean, what are your thoughts about, it sounds as though a lot of this comes down to how the child trusts the teacher and how safe they feel. What is your sense of that? And some teachers struggle with this because when they try to do the right thing, they try to be nice, they often get the big pushback because the kids don't trust them and it's not safe just yet. What is your kind of tips around teachers being able to do that, Nicola?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's very different depending on the age of the child. With early years and with young children, I think it is about being nurturing in your approach. It's about, we tend to talk about a metal box with velvet lining. So there's real strong boundaries. We're not just saying do whatever you want. That there's routine, there's boundaries, but within that there's nurture, there's compassion, there's empathy, there's fun, which there's sometimes in some schools there's not a lot of that. But understanding that for that child, they live such an intense life, they may still be in that intense environment at home. And to come into school and feel that they can have fun and that they can laugh and, it's okay to be themselves is really, really important. So for me, a lot of it is about stepping back and thinking about relationships. So, how would you like to be spoken to, I guess? So the stern voices, the disapproving looks, the shouting obviously is not going to create a safe space. With older children, I think it gets a little bit trickier because we tend to, it's more about banter really. It's more about that kind of fun kind of relationship where you might have a different handshake to one person to another, or the way that you treat them is different. But again, for me, it's about trying to understand why they're doing what they do. And when we do this arbitrary, you're not allowed to talk in class, that's it. I remember the first week that my middle son went to high school, and teachers tend to be very hard in the first week, to lay down the law. But for children who are terrified of coming into school, it just, just creates more anxiety. So I remember him coming back, he had his first detention, which he was mortified by it. And the reason he got it was there was a ruler on the floor, and he said to somebody else, "Is that your ruler?" And the teacher said, "If you talk again, you'll be in detention." So he said, "Is that your ruler?" again. And so he got detention. But it's just pointless, because you're terrifying a child who's already terrified. You're not going to get a good result from it, really.
Yeah, and I think Kay has this really nice saying. She says, there's nothing you can do that is more frightening than what this child's already seen. And I always remember that, and it's just a useful thing to remember, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. That's true.
I really love the analogy of the metal box with the velvet lining. I'm going to remember that one. What do you see as the biggest barriers in school to being able to find that balance where you're not going down the path of lots of punishment, but you can be nurturing with some of these children?
I think the biggest barrier for me, and it's not just in school, it's actually in society, so in parenting, in the way that we do everything, is that everything seems to be about behavior modification. So it's kind of puppy training. So if we can get this child to sit still, then we'll give them a treat. And then that, they'll sit still again because we've given them a treat. But that doesn't work with children like this. And I actually think that's not a great way for all children. Schools will say, well, I can't spend all my time on this one child. So they want a program, they want something that will take the stress of that child away. And they do. I mean, most every educator I've met cares about the child very much. They go over and above to try and help them. But I don't think it's about that. They kind of imply that it's going to take me more time to have to adapt things for this child. But actually, if we could look at all of our children in this way, if we had an approach that was more about emotional literacy, it was more about, getting to what's underneath their behavior, relationship, looking at, their personality. If we had a wider approach to the way that we educate, in my mind, it wouldn't be as big a deal as people think it is, in terms of having to, I need more staff to do that, and the funding. We get those kind of comments a lot about, funding and not having enough people, not having the resources to do all that. But I do think, at the moment, I'm thinking of a kind of blog post that I'm going to write, which is about one size actually can fit all. Because sometimes we say one size doesn't fit all, which I've said that a lot, in terms of you can't treat a child with trauma the same way as you treat a child without. But actually, if we had a more emotionally intelligent approach to children across the board, that one size could fit all. Because if we can get it right for our most vulnerable children, then it's going to be right for our other children. Because I often hear people say, well, you know, that our reward system and our sanctions, it works for a child who's well behaved. But I know that if you took that, you know, here we have a lot of traffic light systems on the ward, you have the same.
Yeah.
You know, the red, amber, green, and everybody starts in green and then they get moved up and down. Real shame riddled, really. But I was in a school the other day where they were talking about this, and actually they said, you know, for the well-behaved children, we think it works, but actually if you took it off the board, they'd still be well-behaved.
Yeah.
That's not the thing that's making them well-behaved. It's their, you know, it's their sense of who they are and their value and their morals and all of that. What it is doing to our vulnerable children is it's creating more shame, and it's making them terrified to come into school, and it's, you know, making their behavior worse and all that. So actually it's detrimental across the board. So yeah, I think that's our biggest barrier, is trying to understand that we've got to get back to basics instead of just putting on another program, or let's do this approach. So at the moment some schools are doing conscious discipline. If you come across that in American, which is fine, and it sounds, you know, like it's good, that the principles are good, but again, it's when schools hear something like that, the staff, they're often like, oh, another program, we've got to learn a whole new thing. And but actually, to me, it's about getting back to basics of relationship. Of, you know, do we actually know our children in our classrooms? Do we know in secondary, particularly in high school? Most of the teachers don't know my children at all, and my children don't know their names. You know, so you're like, there's no relationship. So how on earth are they going to know that talking about domestic violence in the drama lesson is going to trigger my daughter, you know? So to me, it's much more basic than what we seem to be trying to do.
Absolutely. And I think working in an attachment sensitive way, in a trauma-informed way, or whatever you want to call it, I think it's not even just about the children. It's really about how we treat the school community, isn't it? It's about how the principal interacts with the teachers, how the teachers interact with each other. And it's about, I think, recognizing that it's less about kind of compliance and more about people reacting to the stressful environments that they've been put in, and that we need to kind of reach out and kind of support everybody, really, with the sort of compassion that the kids deserve as well.
Definitely. It's one of the things that we've noticed a lot in this country, is there's very little support for staff, for education staff. If you were, you know, a counsellor or a psychologist, you get supervision, you get clinical supervision. You don't in schools. There isn't a place for them to go and talk about really stressful situations that they have with the children that they're working with, in a non-judgmental kind of, you know, fashion that's not about assessment. So they can't go to their boss and say, you know, I'm really struggling with this child, I really don't like them. You know, that's going to affect their job. So we're working on a program at the moment to try and bring more kind of coaching, more spaces of supervision, whether that's in a group or whether that's one-to-one, because we don't do it. It's not really general practice here. So, and some of the staff are working with really challenging children on a daily basis, being, you know, hit and spat at and sworn at, and, you know, you think that's really difficult, and they're taking that home with them. That's affecting their mental health. You know, so yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's culture, isn't it? It's changing the whole culture in a workplace, in a school, where the staff, the senior leaders, all of the staff, the lunchtime supervisors, you know, everybody, the children and the parents who come in are feeling that this is a safe and a calm place to be, really.
Yeah, yeah. I'm really curious about your work around, providing coaching and supervision and things like that. Do you have any kind of examples, or even kind of have a way of explaining how teachers are actually finding that useful, Nicola?
Well, I don't as such, because we've only just started.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, in my talking to them about this area, I really believe that it would be very useful, because they're not getting it anywhere. We've started it with a couple of people, but we haven't really started it in earnest. So yeah, I'm looking at, and again, it's funding. It's getting the schools to understand that this is something worth putting some investment in, because it will keep your staff in the school. It will help the children. All of those reasons. So no, I can't really.
Yeah, that's all right. But I think a lot of this is about kind of pushing to do things differently and being flexible and things like that. And you've written a little bit about, using music and arts and things like that to support kids with attachment difficulties. Could you speak to that a little bit, Nicola, and how that's worked?
Yeah. I mean, I have written a bit about music, about drama. I've really seen with my own children that the arts, any kind of expression of how they feel, is really good. My daughter writes songs that they're her lyrics. I'm not sure they're ever going to be out there in the charts, but they're really expressive, and she doesn't express herself usually. So it's a really good way of her expressing herself. We've seen lots of children use music in terms of regulating. So if they come into a classroom and they're really stressed, whether that's one child on their own and they're listening to music in their headphones, or whether it's the whole class, doing the whole kind of mindfulness type approach. And I just think instinctively, any of those kind of arts that are touching the different parts of our brain are going to help, really, because for a lot of these children, the kind of academic part of the brain, if you like, finds it really hard to articulate. So being able to express how they're feeling, they're not going to necessarily do that in words, but they might be able to do that in a picture, or in a or in music or something like that. All of my children really have done drama, have done music to some extent, sport. They do a lot of animal therapy, is something that we have seen works really well here as well. Horse therapy. We have some schools where they'll bring dogs in, and just that kind of regulation of being around. They're very docile dogs. They don't do an awful lot, but being around, the animals and that kind of environment really helps. The only problem I have, or the challenge in these areas, is for the teachers of music and drama to understand that a lot of the subjects that they do are going to trigger things, particularly drama. So we've had a lot of conversations with the school that my children are at on the subjects that they do. As I kind of mentioned earlier about domestic violence, if you're doing a whole term on domestic violence, you're going to expect that that's going to trigger an awful lot for a child. And the response I've got often has been, well, children need to know about these things. And for the majority of children in the class, they probably don't know anything about it. But for those who've lived it, it's very different. And I'm not sure that schools are prepared to be having therapy sessions in their drama class, so if you're going to do it, that's fine, but I need to know first to start with. We need to prepare our children for that, and also you need to be prepared that she may be coming out crying every lesson. Somebody needs to manage that process with her. So yeah, I think all those things are great and very therapeutic, as long as they're done in a way that people understand that you're going to be managing some fallout of that, really, and processing it with them, helping them to process things.
Yeah. I think I was recently listening to someone who was talking about triggers, who said, talking about something that's triggering is akin to putting a big novel in front of a child who's got dyslexia and expecting them to read it. And I thought that was quite a nice way to explain it. And it's just that awareness about its impact on them, really, isn't it? That is
absolutely.
Yeah.
My daughter was expected to, in the drama course, which was for her GCSE, so for her final results, she was expected to act the part of a girl who was part of a sibling group of 3, which is exactly her experience, whose mom abandoned them by leaving a note in the cereal packet one day, and she leaves. So it's about these 3 teenagers trying to cope with that. So you can't expect her to be able to give her best for her exam in a subject that's going to be so triggering. She's just not going to be able to do it.
Yeah, it's incredibly hard. It sounds like your daughter has moved on from school, and you've done a lot of work with adults as well. How do you see this stuff playing out into adulthood? We get a lot of teachers, one of the messages we really push is how important teachers are in terms of particularly for kids who continue to live in homes where there's a lot of threat, in terms of providing them a kind of template and role model for healthy relationships. How do you see it play out into adulthood, Nicola?
Yeah, this is a really interesting area, and it's something that I'm working through myself as my children get older. So my daughter's 17. I also do quite a lot of work with youth groups where they're older and going into kind of adulthood. And it's a really interesting question, isn't it? I'm torn between. Well, I'm not torn, but I'm trying to work through when is the cutoff point, and is there a cutoff point for when we say, right, this person is now an adult, and they now cannot keep talking about their past and blaming their past for their behaviour. When do they take responsibility? Because I know many adults in their 50s, 60s who cannot take responsibility for their life, and are still impacted greatly by what happened in their early experiences. So in our education system, we expect a child, certainly over here when they're 16, to be perfectly reasonable enough to get themselves to college and to self-study and to have good relationships, and not to get in trouble with the police. When they're 18, they're an adult. Surely they can get a job and all the rest of it. But I know from the experience with my own daughter, well, to start with, she's not emotionally the same age as she is chronologically. So she may be 17 and she may have to go to college because that's what we have to do here. She's not ready for that. And she's certainly not ready to be living on her own and making those decisions. But I think for me, you cannot, the cutoff point, I guess, is different for every person. And I think it's when that person has dealt with some of the stuff in their past. It's all a process and a journey. So I'm not saying that anybody has to be perfect, but to be able to work through some of those things where you're in a position where you can take responsibility. So I'll give you an example from my own experience. Some stuff that happened for me in my childhood. I remember going through some counselling when I was in my mid-20s, I guess. And the people who were counselling me said, look, how you've responded in your relationships up to now is not your fault, because you didn't know. It was a pattern of behaviour. Now you know, now you're aware, in any future relationships that, you have more responsibility in that because you now know. And when I think about my children who, it's a bit more complicated because them knowing something is a bit more difficult. But my daughter, for example, she now is fully aware of her attachment needs. We talk a lot about brain development. She knows about her avoidance. So she takes responsibility for that more, where she'll come to me and say, I need to talk to you about something. Not all the time, but she's grown, particularly over the last year since she's left school, to a point where I think she'll be able to, at some point, and I don't know when that is, take full responsibility for her actions, for what she does. So for me, a lot of it, and when you talk about teachers and anybody who works with a child like this, we have the same in adoption, is for the adult to be really aware of their own attachment history, to be self-aware as much as you can be, to be reflective, to think, why is that triggering me so much and it's not triggering my husband, for example. So understanding our own attachment style, our own history, because we're all on that attachment spectrum. I think that's really important. I've seen that with schools as well, is to understand more about, if they change as an adult, what impact does it have on the child, instead of always concentrating on the child changing, but actually being able to step back and say, well, actually, what was my part in this? I was a bit too stern there, whatever it might be. So yeah, I think it's a really difficult one. I think it's I heard somebody speak a while ago. It was a lady who'd been through care herself, and she's now in her 40s. And she said, really what we're doing is creating a space for recovery. So we're not fixing them. I'm not trying to fix my children. I'm just trying to create a space where they can recover. So I'm trying not to hinder their recovery. I'm trying to enhance it. And I know that that's going to take years. So some of that won't work with their own children and all of those, whatever might come in the future. So for me, I think it's about creating that space and trying to help people to be self-aware.
I think what's lovely about that story is that it feels like your daughter has the permission to come back and to go out and then to come back, this idea of kind of that secure base with you. Which is kind of what we want with a lot of these kids, isn't it? That we still have that safety net, because we know they're not quite ready yet, but it's not about just wrapping them up in cotton wool and overprotecting them. It's about still being there for them to know that they can come back. That way they feel less alone. Absolutely. Could you say just a couple more things just about that piece about being self-aware? And I know for a lot of teachers, the way they make sense of this is, it's almost, you don't have to ever prompt it. The first thing they say is, well, this wasn't how this wasn't how it was when I went to school, or this isn't how we were raised, or anything like that. When you mean self-aware, what do you think that actually means for teachers when they're actually, having a tough time with a student?
I think I guess in the context of school, they first need to understand or appreciate that their values, ways of thinking, approaches are very different to a child who's had a very different background. And we do that through a number of different exercises, getting them to understand that, if those building blocks in an early child's development aren't there, then their normal is not the same as your normal. So, we think, it's inappropriate to swear at people, but for them it might be very appropriate to swear at people. We think that pushing people out of the way is wrong, but for them in their environment that might have been, the norm. So I think getting them to understand that that things are different for another child. Again, somebody else I heard speak a while ago, another lady who'd been through the care system, talked about maps. So we've all got these maps of how the world works, and she didn't know that her map was any different to anybody else until she came into contact with a very good foster carer who showed her that there was a different map, there's a different way to live. And I think often I've heard from teachers or from any adult with a child like this, why can't they just do what we tell them to do? Or, that's not how I would have done it. And there's just no respect for people. And I think it's just getting them to understand that that's about our values and understanding that they're very different to theirs and accepting that theirs are different. And I guess the difficulty is for people to accept that that a child, how do I say this? That I think what we tend to say is, well, that's the way it should be. And yes, that maybe that is the way it should be in terms of we don't all swear at each other, but that's not the way it is for that child. So what I try to do sometimes, people say, look, you know, we had a discussion actually this week in a school about swearing. So somebody had said that this is in very early years. So this child says how he feels in a way that's, you know, might not be appropriate. So he talks about being pissed off. And that for me is okay, because that word doesn't really bother me. But for some other people, it obviously does. And in the school context, the senior leaders who were there were like, oh, you know, we can't respond in the same way. Whereas we were talking about, you know, how we have to, you know, mirror their effects. So if a child is really distressed, then we would talk in the same kind of way. And we would use similar language. But of course, we're not saying you swear at them. But I think it's just, for me, it's challenging our own understanding and our own values and thinking, what is it about swearing that's so offensive to me? What is it about spitting? What is it about sexualized behavior? We all have different elements of what a child might do that you know, that we get offended by. But that's generally more about our upbringing, isn't it? And our understanding. What I do hear often, and I totally understand this, is well, they wouldn't be allowed to do that out in the world. They won't be allowed to, you know, swear at people on the street. They won't be allowed to punch people, which obviously it is true. But I think it's just understanding that sometimes it's about our approach to them. So all behavior communicates something. So if I react to somebody swearing at me, I'm not really getting to what's underneath it. You're just looking at the surface stuff. And I'm sure you've come across Brian Post's work. I don't know whether you know him from America. He talks about you know, shutting down the pathways of expression. So if you stop them from rolling their eyes and tutting, and, you know, and we say, oh, don't roll your eyes at me, and, you know, who do you think you're talking to? Then it goes down into feelings, and eventually it comes out in behavior. And the only way we can stop the behavior is by allowing them to express. And that's difficult in school. I understand that. But if we don't allow them to express, or help them to find more appropriate ways to express, so anger is probably the one, you know, the most difficult one, and the one that's kind of, you know, out there, is helping them to find healthy ways of expressing that anger, instead of just saying it's wrong to throw a chair. Well, yeah, and most, you know, the child probably knows it's wrong to throw a chair, but they're not in control of that in that moment when they've, you know, dysregulated, are they? So yeah, I think it's trying to get adults to not be offended by the behavior, and to try and look underneath at what's driving the behavior. And then, you know, when we can relieve that anxiety, children generally behave in a different way anyway.
I was thinking about your little quote before about having a space for recovery, and I wonder for educators if it's about having a space for learning, really, and learning, not just academic learning, but just social and emotional learning, and you know, how much of that has to do with our own beliefs, and how much of that can we flexibly do as adults for this child, because they're going to learn it well, they probably won't learn it out in the real world, because it's all about punishment and consequences, which we know aren't the best teachers. Thank you. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I don't think they do get any time or space or even learning about managing their own emotions at school. I think it's all about the children. And I know as a parent, if you can't manage your own emotions, you can't help a child. And that's what they're missing, I think, in education, is understanding that, you know, we've got to manage our own stuff before we can help them.
Nicola, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing things from your personal life and from your training experience. What are you working on at the moment? What are you curious about at this stage?
Well, the thing I've just talked about with the self-care, that space for adults to work through, I'm working on that. Also, we are kind of going a little bit more into something's popped up on my computer. We're going a little bit more into teenage areas, because over here there's not a lot of help, certainly for parents, adoptive parents, for teenagers. There tends to be a lot of early intervention, which I totally understand why that is. But there's still a lot of people out there who are struggling with their teenagers, and most of the adoption breakdowns happen in teenage years. And with schools as well, of course, once they get to secondary, it really gets much more difficult. So personally, I'm looking at different ways of understanding more about that myself. So I've started doing a bit of mentoring with some young people, and I'm doing a counselling course for teenagers around the arts later on in the year. As a business, it's more about that the coaching kind of package. And we tend to focus more on trying to create a community. So what's happened a lot over here over the last few years is more schools are attachment aware. But for me, it's more about being attachment focused. So it's not just being aware of it and having a 3-hour training, but it's how do we change culture? So we're working with the local authority in North Wales to look at piloting a program with a few schools where we can actually embed the learning. So really go into their behaviour policies, teaching emotional literacy to all the staff, not just pastoral staff. Finding ways that we can actually change a culture, which I think is quite huge, really. So a few things. I'm also looking at writing another book at the moment, which is based on, which is more like a novel, but it's based on a child at school. So it's a child in a difficult home environment. So it's what school feels like from his perspective. So I'm working on that at the moment as well.
That sounds excellent. You've got a lot going on at the moment. Thank you, Nicola. Was there any websites or resources that people can kind of go to kind of get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. They can go to our website, www.bravehearteducation.co.uk. We have some free resources there, some ebooks for schools and for parents. We also have an online course in attachment, and blogs. I do regular blogs. There's lots of content on there if people want to do that. We also have a Facebook page, Braveheart Education, and we have Braveheart Parents page, which is adopters, foster carers, any parents who are interested in this area. The more the merrier. We'd love to see people on there.
Excellent. And we'll put up those links on the show notes as well. Thank you so much, Nicola. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it too. Thank you.
No worries. Take care.
All right. You too.
That was our interview with Nicola Marshall. Thank you to Nicola for sharing her experience with us. To access the resources and websites discussed in the interview, check out the show notes by visiting www.tipbs.com. If you're enjoying listening to our podcast, please rate and review it on iTunes. Your ratings make all the difference. Thank you for listening. See you next time.